Recently, my wife and I took a trip to Chicago, Illinois. While we were there, we got the opportunity to visit Paul Sereno's fossil lab, which was just an all-around amazing stop. While we were there, we got the chance to speak with Paul Sereno about a few really cool topics. If you don't know, Paul Sereno is a paleontologist who quite famously described Suchomimus, Spinosaurus mirabilis, and the recently discovered Edmontosaurus mummies that revealed a lot about their general appearance. It was fantastic speaking with him. He pretty much covered all bases. He answered pretty much most of the questions that I had before I even had a chance to ask them. So we have a really cool video to get into with this one. So just kind of sit back, relax, and just listen to Paul Sereno talk about Spinosaurids. So yeah, first we'll just begin with talking about Spinosaurus mirabilis. What can you tell us about this beautiful, amazing specimen?
Well, so we found the first pieces, didn't even realize what we were looking at, because I was lured to the site by one passage in a French monograph by a very debonair, very quiet Frenchman who lived a long time ago, and it was his daughter that related that he had spent 15 years. He basically did the map of the core heart of the Sahara by going there under conditions that would make our conditions even look reasonable, by camel sometimes. And he had this one locality that was my Shangri-La for a long time. He described Carcharodontosaurus teeth and never figured them, never logged them in any collection. He was working for a geologic survey. So I'm actually working on this now in France to see if we can find the teeth that were found originally at this site. But he said there's a site called Acaraceras, and there's dinosaurs at it. I knew it was small. I knew that the chance of finding it was probably remote. It could be covered by sand. You're in the middle of sand seas, and it moves around. And it was long ago, 75 years ago. So what would it look like today? All we had was a dot on a map, no GPS, nothing. So we went hat in hand to try and get there, and it was in a very difficult to get to remote part. So in 2019, I ran a whole expedition to see if we could get to Acaraceras and find it. And of course, on our GPS, we arrived out in the middle of the desert. There was nothing there. 360, absolutely nothing, flat as a board. I knew that. I was prepared for that, so I wasn't overly shocked. And I said, okay, we had drones, we had binoculars, we had everything. I said, okay, let's go north. And we drove a couple of kilometers, a couple of miles north, get up on the top of the car, send out the drones, and one of my colleagues spotted from the binoculars a little lump of rock and said, you know, there's not much else here, let's go. And sure enough, we were attracted to the same knob that he was. And as we pulled up, we saw Carcharodontosaurus teeth. And we got out, and we collected about 30. We exhausted the locality in 2.5 days. It was a hike to get out there, and then we retreated back to the oasis, which is a day and a half away, and had about 3 days left, and I thought there wasn't anything else around there. We probed. I thought, well, okay, hey, we found it. We found 30 Carcharodontosaurus and found some Spinosaur teeth, but there's no skeleton or skull to be had there. And I thought, okay, well, we're going to have to see what we can do with 3 days. I'm not sure how far we can get to looking at another place. When a man walked into the camp he rode into the camp on a little Honda. It was a friend of somebody's. He said he knows the desert, and he knows there's some big bones there. Now, we'd heard a lot of stories, back and forth about, you have to take it with a boulder of sand. Sometimes when someone comes up, they got this, they got that. But this guy seemed really cool. And I asked him, so big bones, really? And what color are they? And he said they're black. Now, I had never seen black bones in the Sahara. Gadafao bones are not black. They might be white, gray, red, not black. But I asked him a few more questions, and he seemed credible. He wasn't trying to exaggerate anything. He said, yeah, they're just over there. Over there? Okay. That's further out in the desert. And he said, further than Acaraceras. And okay. Sounds interesting. And I looked at my team and I said, okay, we're going to follow this guy. And so we had 3 days. I didn't know it would take a day and a half to get there. I thought it was just over there. It would take maybe a good part of a day. But in fact, it took us half of our time to reach there. So we had no time left and no gas. We arrived and he just drove like a bullet for a day and a half, if you can imagine this. It looked like he was going in a straight line. He drove right up to the biggest bone I've ever seen in this area. It was 6-foot thigh bone, attached to it a tibia and a fibula. It was a new titanosaur. Biggest sauropod I've ever seen in my life, and there it was. And then there were vertebrae, and then whew, there's pieces of jaw bones of theropods. Sun going down, crack of dawn the next day, we get ready to leave, we got a half an hour. So Dan Vidal and I were out there. We went scurrying around. We had seen some evidence of predators. We had to bring back something. And so we grabbed a couple pieces of a jaw, thinking that what we had was Carcharodontosaurus. And you can see the hematite sort of stuck to it. It was quite hard to prepare this. And in fact, at various points, the preparators stopped and said, we're better off with a CAT scan of this than me trying to take it off. But the pieces came together, and all of a sudden I emailed Dan. I said, Dan, we found Spinosaurus, not Carcharodontosaurus. And it was a very low maxilla. So you're looking at a maxilla of a normal theropod as a triangular sort of bone. This was particularly low, and it was preserved up here. And we had the opposite side. Then we had bones that for the life of us, we couldn't figure out. This sort of looked like a distal end of a tibia, but it just didn't make any sense. We prepared what we could off of it. It was asymmetrical, wind weathered, and Dan was the first to say, could this be cranial, like the jaws? Could this be the top of the frontals, the top of the snout, smushed a bit? Well, then what is this? Is this the crest? We had lots of ideas, but weren't willing to quite say. But we knew we had to go back. And so that day came after COVID, and I assembled a rigorous team, and we headed back to see if we could find more of this animal at that site. And within minutes of arriving, they come running over, and of course we were rolling with the film, so it's all on film. And what came to the surface, and this is a copy of it, what they found brushing back the sand was the premaxilla, right where we found the two maxillae. As a matter of fact, we could fit one of the maxillae onto the premaxilla, but this was in place. And so we dug up the premaxilla, and then we found other pieces around. In fact, it was parts of a skull. And literally within an hour, Dan kicked up this piece. And this is the top of the skull, a nasal with a beautiful part of the crest. And then we realized, okay, so this is a bigger individual. This is a juvenile. Then he found another one. We had 3 crests of this animal, and we began to piece together the skull while we were out there. On the first day, we knew we had a monumental story. This was a different species, because the crest is so different than the crest you'd find on we had good pieces of the crest of Egypticus, the original species. And it's definitely sort of a flange-like thing, a little fluting. It looked nothing like this.
Right.
And we have 3 copies now to look at. They're a little bit different, but they all have this scimitar shape, and it would have extended up, and you can see the growth, and then we looked inside, and there's vasculature and so on. So this is got a little bit lower of a snout even than Spinosaurus aegypticus, which has a very low snout.
Yeah.
And so we eventually found postcranial bones and so on. This is a new species. It's close, but it's definitely a new species, and that's the story around the discovery of the astonishing Spinosaur. Now, we hope to go back. These animals, of course, are outrageous. This is one of the teeth that we found on our original trip in. They're pretty spectacular. They're smooth and pointed. And we do believe that mirabilis was like Egypticus in that the teeth interdigitated. So these teeth, instead of going inside the maxilla tooth, the dentary tooth, would ultimately come outside and leave sort of this, we call it a festoon margin on the maxilla and the premaxilla, because the dentary teeth at the front did the same thing. So we don't know how far down this goes, because this is not true in Suchomimus and the other branch. All the teeth are inside like normal. So this is a fish-eating adaptation of the Spinosaurines, and it's just fun to tease apart some of the fine details of what they were doing in terms of procuring fish. But this animal was so big, it lived alongside a carcharodontosaur. We made a very exciting discovery of the carcharodontosaur. So they were definitely eating different things. But Africa is really different than North America and a lot of other faunas where you have one large predator. There were many. And actually, in the faunas that we're seeing, a mix of both ornithopods and sauropods, more so than we find, in North America. You either have ornithopods at the end and hard to find a sauropod, or you find sauropods running all over the place and really hard to find a reasonably small Camptosaurus. Here we've got, large ornithopods and multiple sauropods. So it really is a different habitat, a lost world, if you will. In North America, when I was collecting the Tyrannosaur, I could go in other parts of the land formation and literally see a Mesozoic mammal jaw and pick it off the surface. These are so hard to find in most formations that you could find a multituberculate jaw and just in the middle of it, you can sieve for them, but to find it just laying on the surface because you were out crawling around a microsite is amazing. In all the work I've done in Africa, I've never found one, and we are really hoping to find one now at this microsite. But the mammals are so scarce. Instead, what you find are all these crocodilians that are filling in for the mammals. They eat plants, so you have Auripasuchus, we're going to name some more. There's dinosaur eaters down to small. There's one that's upright that's lost all the armor. They've just flourished. So this is Africa's lost world. It's a world run amok with crocodiles filling in for mammals. And the animals that you're used to seeing, Tyrannosaurus, duckbills, ceratopsians, they don't exist. You're seeing a noticeably different world. And it's very exciting to be pulling up the new animals under those circumstances. Because you go to a place like this and it's not just mirabilis, all of them will be new.
Right.
Yeah.
So do you think that it's like mammals were just simply not as abundant at that time?
I think they must be there. We're going to find them. They found a part of one crown in materials that were collected by Takei years ago. We found a microsite that's staggering. We didn't know if we could collect it because there's a million bones there. Microsites, no one has found a legitimate microsite in Africa yet.
Right.
We have so many here that we just take them for granted sometimes. Even in the Morrison, they have a site, Fruto, where you get small things. In North America, there's many sites. The rivers sort them out, and you get just myriad numbers of teeth and small things. We never found that in Africa for reasons just of, I think the formations geology was a bit different. We finally found one. It's just chock-a-block full. And it's in Gedafau. And we are going to find everything in there. New pterosaurs, and if there's a mammal, it'll be in there. There's new ornithopods, small ornithopods, we can just see on the surface. There's articulated fish. There'll be dozens of new taxa. We have a scarab beetle in the formation, and so it was one of the highlights of the when we came there with a diamond saw. I mean, would we be able to do it? And it was almost like Michelangelo. We made a rectangle, and then I sat there with a chisel and gave it 2 taps, and it just came out like a block. It turned out there was an area about 6-7 inches deep, a layer that was weak, and you could just take the entire microsite, which is what we did, 9 tons. And then we made another discovery, which is equally important. While we were out there with microsite people on my team, they took a block and they put some water on it, and it's water soluble. So you can actually soak it in water and then work off the matrix. And no acid, nothing. That's how it's going to prepare very fast.
Yeah.
Now, if it was in a normal climate, not the hyper-arid Tenere Desert, I mean, the water probably would have washed it all away. It's just stunning that it can be prepared efficiently, because you can spend years preparing that much of a microsite. So we're going to be able to process it. And in there is going to be the answer to, a much more diverse small fauna. We see on the surface, there's one tail of Nigersaurus and one little bit of Suchomimus on the surface. We know they were there. And there's a lot of teeth from these animals, but it's all the rest of the menagerie that we're going to get now.
Okay.
Yeah.
So Speaking of Suchomimus, this is something I wanted to bring up to you. There has been a proposal recently that Suchomimus is possibly a junior synonym of Cristatosaurus.
Yeah.
And I thought this would be the perfect opportunity to hear your thoughts on that, considering the fact that, of course, you described Suchomimus initially.
Yeah, and so there was, Cope and Marsh are in the 19th century, but every once in a while we have competition in the modern world that brings back subterfuge and so on. I think I'd given a talk at SCP. We had found Suchomimus, and not just a small bit of it. We found, in fact, we found a beautiful snout and there that we thought we had the whole skull, because no one at that point knew how stretched out the maxillae was. It's even more stretched out than in the Spinosaurians. It's just because baryonyx was the information we had at that point. It was a wonderful find in England, but they only found a chunk of the maxilla, and so they reconstructed it much more like a sort of a normal-ish theropod. When we found the snout, it was outlandish. But we still felt that the snout was fairly close to baryonyx, and we would be better making the type this fully adult monster skeleton that we had found. It only had a section of the jaw, the maxilla, but we had a lot of the skeleton. We had forelimb, hind limb, foot, vertebrae from every part of the column, and so we made that the type. And I spent a lot of time preparing it, reconstructing it. We actually physically reconstructed it for an announcement on the stage at National Geographic, and I had an artistic idea. At that point, I didn't have so many artists to go to of how I might get the cover of Science, and I thought, well, it has to scream Africa, it has to scream something about this unbelievable dinosaur. So I lined up all the thumb claws. I went to the library. This is the behind-the-scenes story for the cover of Science that no one knows. And I wanted a map that had all the names coming away from Africa. As you can see, it was Africa's 19th century map. So I went to the map library, and they had one. And I said, could I borrow? No, you can't borrow this. This is like, it's going to blow away. No, okay, can I make a Xerox copy of it? And I did. I made a Xerox copy, and then I taped together the Xerox copy, and I rolled it up to look like the original, laid it on a table, and put the claws on top. Cover of Science. And I was an artist originally, and I love visualizing things. And so we had the real story of a Spinosaur for the first time. In fact, I was told that when I announced it at National Geographic, fully reconstructed, it's an impressive animal. Suchomimus is 35 feet long. The animal is quite large. Not as large as Spinosaurus, but just impressive. And it was the first time we'd had a 3D mount. So they had done sort of a little plaque mount of baryonyx, but it wasn't as big a specimen, and this was really impressive. And I was told that, I later had a chance to meet him, but I was told that Spielberg saw that and said, well, what is this? It was the first, you can talk about Spinosaurus and all this, but when you physically see something reconstructed from hard fossils that you can point to, not lithographic, drawings, it was shocking. And he said, but there's no tyrannosaurs over in Africa? No. They had Spinosaurus. Well, then that, entered Jurassic Park 3. Yeah. And we've been on a Spinosaur binge ever since. And but to go back to the name and the controversy and so on, I decided I have to get younger. Okay, so I'm going to have to go into social media. I've decided, with this story being the final little kicker, because I don't want to let this sit for months, maybe even as much as a year, until a repost is published. No, I'm gonna go out and release my ideas about this, which is that I wouldn't defend. I want the right name. So I've named enough. I'm not like a football player that gets stickers on the skull for the number of names that I name. So I want the right name on this dinosaur, and the right name is Suchomimus tenerensis. Why? Because before I could come out with that name based on a good skeleton, not even a half a skull, Cristatosaurus was published on the basis of fragmentary remains that Philippe Decay had found years before in the same formation. It came out about a month or two before the Science paper came out. It came out early enough that I could actually, in proof copies, get a note in there. And I looked at the paper. I was, not thrilled that there was another paper naming something from the Gedafau Formation. What was their type material? And when I saw the type material, I said, okay, well, this is not valid. For reasons that the premaxilla, which is this portion of the skull here, the premaxilla has a pretty similar shape in Baryonyx and Suchomimus, which is why I didn't choose the skull. I had many premaxillae of Suchomimus actually from the formation, and I knew that that was, for me, uncomfortably close to Baryonyx. And the type specimen, worse, had more erosion than what you see here. In fact, the crest portion, which is more in this position here in Suchomimus, was completely eroded off. It was fused, battered premaxillae, and to see the crest, they referred to a second individual. They call them individuals, but there's no information that they're individuals. So in the case of Suchomimus, the holotype, we have a map. We found it all in one area. It's one animal, rights, lefts. It's a beautiful type specimen. In the case of Cristatosaurus, the type is 3 pieces of maxilla. They don't connect together. We don't know where they were found relative to each other. So quite frankly, I would say probably the premaxilla is the real holotype, if you wanted to say, and then the other pieces, which are not diagnostic anyway. But unfortunately, that premaxilla is not diagnostic. And what they did in the paper was a quick shuffle to say that a second individual, which also has no association, there's like a dorsal vertebra, another premaxillary fused pair, and a few other odds and bits. This second individual shows that the crest is unique, and that was unique enough to hang your hat on instead of Suchomimus on. And what we can easily show from all the scanning and comparative work that we've done is that not only is the type specimen, the premaxilla, doesn't preserve this, you can't just throw the baton to a second specimen. You have to see the defining features, the diagnostic features in the type specimen. So that's error number 1. The association is questionable. And then error number 2 is that feature itself is actually characteristic. So it's not a matter of appealing to someone wrote to me because a lot of people love Suchomimus, it's a lovely name, and it's a beautiful dinosaur. We'll appeal to the commission. No need. You just need to appeal to logic, and that name is not adequate. It doesn't have an adequate type. The specimens that are associated with it have never been documented, and you can't throw the baton to a second specimen and say, oh yeah, but it's over here. And then secondly, that feature can be shown in CAT scans of Baryonyx and Suchomimus specimens and those 2 specimens to be indistinguishable. So that's why we don't use that. We do need to re-evaluate the diagnosis of Suchomimus because we have done so much work since that original paper. And so, but I am going to suggest that this name is not a valid name and that we should stick with Suchomimus for logical, empirical reasons that anybody can see. And if I didn't have a good case, I wouldn't make it. And we'd use that name even if it was done with a bit of subterfuge. Philippe, I ultimately named a dinosaur after him and we became very good friends, and he's a very reasonable guy. Found those bones many years ago, realized what they were when Baryonyx was published. But ultimately, the decisions on taxonomy have to be made on the ground with facts that we can all agree on. You go to a commission only in desperation after decades of work and the use of a name. We have no need to do that here. Suchomimus tenerensis is a good taxon.
That definitely works for me. And plus, everybo's been kind of losing their mind over it and kind of failing that.
People say this, and I'm not tuned into social media, and
I advise.
People say it's a good thing, but I'm not going to let people wait this long and have them writing me passionate, emails over saving Suchomimus. No, we don't need to go to the commission. This is a good name, and just wait to see what comes out, because Suchomimus, we have a complete CT of the skull, which connects. It's not just the vasculature at the front, but all the way to the endocranium in the back and the orientation of the skull. And, there's a lot that's going to come out on Suchomimus and Spinosaurus, as you know. It's one of the most interesting groups, I have to say.
I agree. I definitely agree. More on Spinosaurus, we're kind of pivoting back to Spinosaurus. There's also, of course, a lot of debate about the swimming affinities of Spinosaurus. I personally don't think it was that great of a swimmer. What can you bring to the table in
Right,
this
so,
small
you know,
section?
I felt this was, of all the lines of evidence we use, this was a smoking gun. You find a big animal that is allegedly aquatic. We have no large aquatic animal that swims in rivers in the middle of a continent. None. Zero in the history of life. So, except the Loch Ness Monster. That's the only one. And, you know, Lake Baikal, Loch Ness, I mean, Lake Michigan, I'm sorry, they don't support whale-sized animals.
Yeah.
You know, killer whales have been sighted in Puget Sound, you know, or going up the, you know, and then you're down to a dolphin-sized animal like an Amazonian dolphin. I've seen one up the Amazon myself personally. Or you can find a record of a tiny, a small, relatively speaking, mosasaur that went up a river, might be in a brackish area. But we just don't find anything. You know, a sea cow goes up a river a little bit, but they're really in the ocean margin for most of their life. They're grazers, they're herbivores, but they're aquatic animals. And then all the other, and so to find this sitting in place in 1 meter of sediment with a new titanosaur, a new ribachisaur, other riverine animals, is for me the smoking gun. But when I look at the animal, I do have a sense. I teach a course called Structure and Function of Vertebrates, which is to look at the skeleton and, like Cuvier, infer the function from the skeleton. And there's nothing about the skeleton of Spinosaurus that suggests it's an aquatic animal. The rigid torso, the billboard-like tail. Every time you go to a modern analog, it screams, no, this is a heron, this is display. And I think that we confirm this is display, and these animals all have crests. The more I looked at it, I realized this group is really heron-like. It really is the only predatory dinosaur group that has sails and midline crests on its skull in all of the species, not just an odd, you know, Ceratosaurus or an odd, you know, Dilophosaurus. This was a group that really went into serious display. And what was it about the environment? Well, maybe it was these coastal regions or riverbank regions where they could really see each other, wanted to defend territories. You know, you look to herons and you look to modern analogs, and it does make a lot of sense to me as a wading animal. Quite frankly, herons, you know, their most success is in water no deeper than this. If you can imagine yourself trying to catch a fish and you're already a big animal, you cannot swim after them. I mean, swordfish have a hard time. They immediately go into herding because they can't, there's too many, the angular momentum on a large animal, you can't track a smaller fish. It's impossible. And so you really have to ambush, you have to make the odds in your favor. Like they don't see you, and you're in air, and you're going to take your beak and your neck and everything through air, and then that last bit, yes, is in water, and you spotted where they are, and you better have teeth or a beak that can spear them or catch them, or if you get their tail, you got them. And this is how Spinosaurus, you know, this is the functional end of why it looks like that, so that if they get it, they've got it. And it's a squirming, slippery target. And so herons, their success, and they will defend, sometimes with their life. They know the intertidal zone means, okay, at 3 to 5 o'clock, this is my area, and don't you come close, and they will defend these territories. We know the blue heron, the great blue heron, which you see around here, it goes up and down the coast, and we know that the habits in life perhaps better than any other heron, and it's one of the biggest and one of the best analogs, I think, for Spinosaurus. So, yeah, I think it could go into 2 meters of water before it would float away. That's plenty of depth. I think probably was sitting in something less than 3 feet to try and catch the bigger lungfish, Mawsonia, and now we have from, ironically, this site, we have what we call superfish, which is a skull of we think it's a polypterid. We need to get the jacket and open it up, but it's I mean, there were big fish, lungfish, Mawsonia, and so coelacanth and polypterids. These fish in the waterways of modern Africa go back all the way into the Cretaceous, and so there were just bigger fish in these rivers to be had. And I think this was, lifestyle that would have its time course and would ultimately disappear.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Paul Sereno, for basically just giving us some insight about these amazing animals. This really was a fantastic stop, and you guys stay tuned for some more possible videos that will be coming from this visit. I at the very least want to get one video out about the Edmontosaurus mummies, because those are absolutely amazing, of course. So thank you so much for watching, and have an awesome day.